Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends, and I see some enemies. I am your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. These are the Dr. Muhammad Files. So today I'm excited to get started with this first part of a two-part research-driven podcast called the Freedmen Segment that uncovers the historical and modern struggles of foundational Black Americans who are the descendants of freedmen and our fight for recognition and liberation. So let's get started.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
We're kicking off this first part of a two-part series by revisiting key concepts from previous episodes. This deep dive it'll ensure that everyone, new and returning listeners alike, fully grasps critical terms like foundational Black Americans, ethno-melanism, and why self-delineation is important. We'll break these ideas down in a clear and comprehensive way to set the foundation for the discussion ahead. In my dissertation, Experiences of Foundational Black American Male Faculty, Exploring Anti-Black Racism at Predominantly White Institutions of Higher Learning, I dedicated an entire section of my literature review to answering a fundamental question. Who are foundational Black Americans? The term foundational Black American has gained prominence in recent years as a means of redefining the unique lineage and identity of Black descendants of freedmen who built the United States from its inception. While Dr. Claude Anderson introduced the term Native Blacks in the 1980s, the phrase was later refined by Tariq Nasheed, who emphasized foundational to avoid confusion with indigenous Native Americans, although, like myself, like my family, we have in a lot of foundational Black Americans have indigenous Native American lineage. But according to official FBA.com, foundational Black Americans are the direct descendants of Black freedmen, those who not only survived slavery, but built this nation economically, socially, and politically, despite centuries of systemic anti-Black racism. Ethnic erasure, what I define as ethno-melanism, a term I coined in my dissertation, combines ethnocide and anti-Black racism to describe the systemic erasure and marginalization of Black ethnic identities and cultures, particularly those of Black American freedmen or foundational Black Americans, depending on the context. The melanin and ethnomelanism highlights the shared skin pigment among Black individuals while underscoring the need to distinguish between groups that may look similar but have vastly different historical and cultural experiences. So today I'll break down the terms Black American Freedman and Foundational Black American, explaining when and why we use each as we dive deeper into this critical discussion. Some may ask, why does it even matter what we call ourselves? We're all just one black family, right? Others may accuse us of being divisive. Yet when asked how many tribes exist in Africa, they acknowledge hundreds. The reality is this, foundational Black American family and friends and enemies. There has been a deliberate attempt, what I define as ethnomelanism, to erase our identity and sever our connection to this land, the United States, which our ancestors built with their blood, sweat, and lives. The dominant society, often using members of our own community willing to sell us out for a personal gain and a few butter biscuits, has pushed a false narrative that distances us from our rightful place in this country. They tell us to look over there, look to Africa, ignoring the fact that many of our direct lineages do not trace back there in the way they claim. For example, if mere ancestry were the measure, then even, and I said this in my last podcast, even Elon Musk, who is from Africa, could be considered what? African American, which exposes the absurdity of this logic. Through labels like people of color and minorities, our unique foundational Black American lineage is being erased and replaced with a broader generic blackness or generic African. We're supposed to be a generic African. It prioritizes the culture of immigrant groups such as Africans and Caribbeans over our town. This is no way degrading Africans and Caribbeans. They have their own culture, their own identity, which is fine. But the truth is, listen, FBA family and friends and enemies, we foundational Black Americans are not immigrants. We did not migrate here like every other ethnic group. Some of our ancestors were here before Christopher Columbus, while others were Africans forcibly brought here. So through ethnogenesis, and I discussed this in one of my previous podcasts, we became a distinct people. Foundational Black Americans or Black American freedmen are a unique, distinct group of people. This identity is not just a name, it's a declaration of our rightful place in history and our fight against systemic erasure. So, as we unpack these concepts, we'll explore how this self-delineation is not just about identity, but also about justice, reparations, and the ongoing fight for recognition. So, foundational Black Americans, or freedmen, we've been fighting for recognition and liberation since day one. The broken promises of Reconstruction, for example, the Freedmen Bureau's portrayal, and the systemic denial of reparations. Everyone's heard about 40 Acres and a Mule through rap songs and different catchphrases, is a historical fact. No one can deny this. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, it was between 1865 and 1877, was a period of significant political and social change aimed at integrating formerly enslaved people into American society. A lot of people don't know that there were, during this time, black people, black freedmen, were elected to political offices. We owned businesses. We started to open up schools. However, many promises made during this time were not fulfilled. Initially, Reconstruction saw significant progress. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? We've been hearing about the 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship specifically for foundational Black Americans, not immigrants coming here um, seeking to get a job. This was not what the 14th Amendment was about. The 15th Amendment protected voting rights for foundational black American freedmen. Again, black men were elected to public office, schools for black children were established, but despite these advancements, the end of Reconstruction led to the rise of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and voter suppression. These laws, along with violent intimidation, stripped freedmen citizens of their rights, undoing much of the progress made during Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau was established, and I would suggest and I would implore us to fight to reestablish the Freedmen's Bureau. It was established in 1865 to assist formerly enslaved people, the freedmen, by providing food, housing, education, and legal aid. However, its efforts were often undermined. The Bureau helped establish schools and provided legal assistance to ensure black workers were paid their wages. You got to remember, foundational black American family and friends, during this time, black freedmen would get hired for jobs, and then the dominant society would not pay those wages. It also played a role in documented workers' contracts and recovering those unpaid wages. Despite these efforts, the Bureau faced significant challenges, including inadequate funding, resistance from anti-foundational black American Southern whites, and Northern whites too. It wasn't just the Southern whites, and corruption within its ranks. President Andrew Johnson's policies further weakened the Bureau by returning confiscated land to former Confederate owners. You got to remember too, foundational black American family friends, we found the freedmen, our ancestors, were never compensated. Slave owners were compensated, but we were never compensated, leaving many FBA families without resources. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, it symbolized the hope for economic independence for formerly enslaved people. People always say, "Well, why? That was over 100 years ago, 150 years ago." I would assert that that debt has never been paid. Just because time has went by does not mean the debt is not due. This promise of 40 acres and a mule was largely unfulfilled. The initial promises were by General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15. And you can research this, foundational black American family. In 1865, it promised 40 acres of land to black freedmen families. This was intended to provide a means for economic self-sufficiency. After Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson reversed these policies, returning land, and it was some foundational black Americans who were actually granted land. A lot of people don't know this. They were actually granted land through this order. But when Lincoln's assassination happened, President Johnson reversed these policies, and the land was confiscated by the Confederates. This left most black freedmen families without the promised land and resources. The systemic denial of the reparations continued, with few black freedmen families receiving any form of compensation for the injustices of slavery. The fight for reparations has continued into the modern era, with scholars and activists arguing for reparative justice to address the lasting impact of slavery and systemic foundational black American racism during that era. Remember, family, let's not conflate racism with slavery that was due, that reparations are for. Yes, there was racism during that era, but this debt is for slavery specifically. So, FBA family and friends and enemies, The Freedmen or Foundational Black Americans fight for recognition during and after Reconstruction. It highlights the broken promises, betrayals, and systemic injustices that have shaped the struggle for racial equality in the United States. Despite significant challenges, the resilience and determination of foundational Black Americans have continued to drive the fight for justice and reparations. In the words of our dear brother, Dr. King, who advocated, the media doesn't talk about how Dr. King advocated for foundational Black Americans to be made whole through reparations. He said, Dr. King said, now when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check. FBA family friends, he was talking about reparations. So in this podcast, we will continue to expose how these historical policies directly impact FBA communities today and why reparations, legal recognition, and economic justice are critical for undoing the damage inflicted by centuries of oppression and anti-Black racism. So there were anti-freedmen legislations established. For example, the rise of black codes, Jim Crow, and convict leasing, it ensured the economic suppression of FBA communities. The systematic anti-Black racism of freedmen did not end with the abolishment of slavery. I'll say that again, FBA family and friends. Systemic anti-foundational Black American racism of freedmen, it did not end with the abolishment of slavery. So no magic wand was waved after slavery and say, oh, racism, it's no longer racism. This is what the dominant society will have you believe. Rather, it evolved into new forms of legal and economic suppression through anti-freedmen legislations. Policies such as the Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, and the convict leasing systems were deliberately designed to maintain racial hierarchy, restrict economic mobility, and entrench the social subjugation of foundational Black Americans. These policies, FBA family and friends and enemies, not only hindered the ability of freedmen to rebuild generational wealth or to build generational wealth, but also reinforce their economic dependence on white controlled systems. So, FBA family and friends and enemies, immediately following emancipation, Southern states enacted what they called the Black Codes. This was between about 1865 and 1866. A series of laws aimed at controlling the labor and movement, not only the labor, but their movement of newly freed Black American freedmen. For example, they didn't allow you to stand on the corner. These laws legally reestablish white dominance by criminalizing everyday activities and forcing Black people into exploitive labor arrangements. Scholarship by W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America, he describes how these laws were designed to create a, quote, quasi-slavery, unquote, status, ensuring that Black labor remained tied to the economic interests of white elites, the dominant society. So Black codes restricted land ownership, forcing Black individuals into exploitive sharecropping arrangements that kept them indebted to white landowners. So it was perpetual slavery. And they even had laws that criminalized Black people, like the vagrancy law, which was broadly defined to target unemployed Black men. So if you didn't have a job, nobody would hire you, or you couldn't establish a job. They just put you in jail and then lease you out. The convicted were fined, and if they could not pay, they were what? Leased out as laborers, effectively reinstating forced labor under a new guise. So slavery. It was slavery. Black workers were prohibited. So let me stop right there for a second. So people say slavery ended in 1865, but in actuality, it did not end in 1865. I would assert it went into the early 1900s. So black workers were prohibited, for example, for leaving jobs without permission from white employers, limiting economic mobility and sustaining white economic dominance. So this takes us to the Jim Crow era between 1877 and 1965, which further institutionalized racial apartheid and economic disenfranchisement. This system, upheld by the infamous, I know many of you have heard of it, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 decision. It legally enforced segregation in public spaces, education, and employment. While it's often framed as a social control mechanism, Jim Crow laws were fundamentally about economic suppression. It denied foundational black Americans access to jobs, property ownership, and a quality education, which are critical components of wealth building or generational wealth. Our dear sister scholar Michelle Alexander in 2010 in the Jim Crow in her piece the new Jim Crow rather, mass incarceration in the age of color blindness, she argues that Jim Crow policies were a blueprint for modern racial caste systems. The economic ramifications of these laws meant that foundational black Americans were systematically excluded from lucrative industries, professional networks, and home ownership opportunities, reinforcing generational poverty. We know, FBA family and friends, that home ownership is a strong mechanism of generational wealth. Black professionals were also barred from white dominated industries, limiting access to high paying jobs and wealth accumulation. The redlining practices, though not explicitly part of Jim Crow, it worked in tandem with segregation laws to deny foundational black Americans access to home ownership. Again, this home ownership is a key driver of generational wealth. This is why during the Civil War, after the Civil War, the Confederates, they passed their land down to their heirs. And what did the freedmen pass down? Nothing. So while they continue to build generational wealth up until today, foundational black Americans were not able to build that generational wealth. Thus, the debt is owed for reparations, reparative justice. In addition, schools for black children were deliberately underfunded, ensuring limited access to quality education and economic mobility. Quality education, home ownership work in tandem to build generational wealth. We know this. We know that it was suppressed for foundational black Americans. Thus, reparations are due, and we're coming to get our check. So, FBA family and friends, perhaps the most direct continuation of slavery was the convict leasing system, and we touched on it a little bit previously, but we're going to go into depth. It was between 1865 and the 1940s. This allowed states to lease black freedmen prisoners to private industries as unpaid laborers. Douglas A. Blackman, in his piece Slavery by Another Name, the Reenslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, he details how this system was a direct effort to maintain black freedmen economic oppression and provide cheap labor for white industries. States passed laws criminalizing minor infractions such as loitering and failing to carry proof of employment. Laws designed to target to specifically target black freedmen men. Those convicted were sentenced to hard labor and leased to railroads, coal mines, and plantations where they were subjected to brutal conditions. The railroads, yes, foundational black Americans built the railroads. They built the initial railroads. Then Asians were brought in as labor to continue the railroads that were already built by foundational black Americans. Make no mistake, family, friends, and enemies, the initial railroads were constructed by freedmen labor. This system, the convict leasing system, was more deadly than antebellum slavery because there was no financial incentive to keep prisoners alive. During the kidnapping, imprisonment, enslavement, the earlier enslavement, they had incentives to keep the prisoners, the kidnapped prisoners, alive. However, the convicts were seen as disposable labor. The convict leasing system, it effectively transferred the labor of freedmen from plantations to prison camps, ensuring that black men remained a permanent underclass, specifically foundational black American men. As historian Kaylee Gross in Hannah Mary Tabbs and the Disembodied Torso, A Case of Racial Passing in the Politics of Race, notes the criminalization of black existence through vagrants laws and petty offenses, it laid the groundwork for the present day industrial complex. So you see, FBA family, friends, and enemies, how the mass incarceration of today is tied with convict leasing of yesteryear. FBA family, friends, and enemies, the economic suppression that was initiated by the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and convict leasing, it continues to have lasting effects on foundational black American communities today. The exclusion of foundational black Americans from wealth building opportunities, specifically land ownership and industries of power, has resulted in a racial wealth gap. Black families today hold significantly less generational wealth than their white counterparts due to centuries of economic exclusion. First slavery, then economic exclusion. Sandy Darity Jr. in 2020, in her piece, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, illustrates how the compounded effects of historical, racial discrimination have prevented foundational black American communities from building sustainable wealth. Mass incarceration as the new convict leasing. We talked about mass incarceration a little bit earlier and how it connects to the convict leasing. The modern criminal justice system, it disproportionately targets foundational black American, echoing, mirroring the vagrancy laws of the Black Codes. And our sister FBA Alexander, she argues that mass incarceration, I believe she's FBA. I don't want to put FBA status on her, and she's not FBA, but I believe she's FBA. Michelle Alexander argues that mass incarceration is the direct descendant of convict leasing. They go hand in hand, ensuring that foundational black American descendants of freedmen communities remain economically and socially marginalized. This is not by happenstance, FBA family friends. This is targeted. The effects of Jim Crow are still seen in discriminatory hiring practice, wage gaps, and systemic barriers to home ownership for foundational black American descendants. I can't emphasize enough, foundational black American friends, family, and enemies, how much ownership is important in generational wealth. The evolution of the anti-FBA legislations, the Jim Crow laws, the black codes, the convict leasing, it demonstrates that the oppression of foundational black American communities has always been intentional, systematic, and economically motivated. While these policies have changed in their form, right, their function remains to do what? To suppress foundational black American economic independence and maintain a racial hierarchy. So, FBA, family, friends, and enemies, in conclusion, the freedmen's fight for recognition during and after Reconstruction, it highlights the broken promises, the betrayals, and systemic injustices that have shaped the struggle for racial equality in the United States. Despite significant challenges, the resilience and, and the determination of foundational black Americans have continued to drive the fight for justice and reparations. The historical and ongoing oppression of foundational black Americans through anti-freedmen legislations like the black codes, Jim Crow laws, up into convict leasing system was not accidental, FBA family, friends, and enemies. These policies were carefully designed to maintain economic, social, and political control over the foundational black American communities, ensuring our systemic exclusion from wealth building and full participation in the American society. The ripple effects of these injustices are evident today in the racial wealth gap, mass incarceration, and continued barriers to land ownership and economic empowerment. Yet, despite these efforts to erase and suppress us, the resilience of foundational black Americans has been undeniable. Our ancestors, foundational black American family, friends, and enemies, our ancestors fought against these oppressive systems, creating thriving communities, pioneering industries, and continuously pushing back against systemic racism. And we must hold the line. Now it is our responsibility to carry that fight forward, not just for recognition, but for true liberation and reparations. In part two of this series, we'll explore the modern manifestations of these anti-freedmen policies and discuss tangible strategies for economic empowerment, legal recognition, and collective self-determination. FBA family, friends, and even enemies, this conversation is far from over. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. Please like the post, share it, and comment below. Signing off, your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad, and these are the Dr. Muhammad Files.